Nearly done. Just look at these wonderful biscuits.
What is happening in my kitchen?
Instead, he found flour in the air, biscuit dough on the long kitchen table, his youngest son, with both hands full, and the French lady meant only to be assessed as a possible bride, standing in the middle of the ruin, like she belonged there more than grief did. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Lady Genevieve de la Fontaine still held the wooden spoon. Little Tommy stared at the doorway as though he had conjured a ghost. Sophie, who had been leaning against Genevieve's skirts, caught her breath and tightened her grip. Henry, old enough to understand danger before adults named it, straightened at once. Nathaniel Sunderland, Duke of Sunderland, stood beneath the stone arch with rain on his coat and shock on his face so naked it almost made him look young. Mrs. Fenwick, the rigid housekeeper who had spent the last 3 years mistaking distance for discipline, arrived 2 steps behind him and made a small noise of triumph. "My lord," she said, "I had not yet had the opportunity to explain." "No," Nathaniel said. He was still looking at Genevieve. She should have curtsied, she knew that. She should have apologized for the children, the mess, the broken rules, the impossible scene before her. Instead, she set the spoon down with care and laid one flour-dusted hand lightly over Tommy's shoulder. "They were hungry," she said. It was the wrong sentence for a woman hoping to impress a duke. It was far too honest for safety. Something unreadable passed over his face. If you have a taste for stories where a house goes cold long before anyone admits it, and where love enters not through seduction, but through the stubborn rescue of abandoned hearts, stay with Quiet Fires of America and let the embers gather. Long before Nathaniel Sunderland understood he loved Genevieve de la Fontaine, Hawthorne Hall had already begun to fail in small, respectable ways. The silver was polished, the accounts were sound, the servants moved quietly. The nursery was supplied, the lessons scheduled, the children dressed properly enough to satisfy visitors. Only tenderness had gone missing. And because tenderness never appears on inventories, the adults had allowed themselves to pretend the household remained whole. Nathaniel's wife, Marianne, had died 3 winters earlier, after a fever took first her strength and then her breath. Nathaniel had met the loss badly, though people called his response dignified. He buried himself in estate disputes, travel, tenant matters, and parliamentary obligations. He spent less and less time in the nursery, because every child carried some echo of the woman he had loved and failed to save. In his absence, management hardened around convenience. Henry, only 10, learned to fold his feelings into obedience, until he looked almost solemn enough to be mistaken for a little man. Sophie, 7, became by turns sharp-tongued and desperate for affection, quick to challenge any promise she did not trust. Tommy, 4, slipped into the lawless little grief of the very young, where tears, laughter, and fury might arrive in the same quarter hour. Mrs. Fenwick called it instability. The servants called it sorrow. Nathaniel called it a phase he would address once the worst of business had passed. It was into this careful emotional wreckage that Lady Genevieve de la Fontaine arrived. Her father was a French marquis who had lost half his influence during years of political and financial uncertainty. Her mother,
English by birth, had spent enough of her youth among old families to know how such arrangements were made. When word came that the Duke of Sunderland might be persuaded toward a second marriage, and that a month-long visit could be arranged through well-placed intermediaries, Genevieve's family accepted with polished gratitude. On paper, the opportunity was flattering. In truth, it was humiliating. She was not being courted, she was being reviewed. Genevieve knew it on the road to Hawthorne Hall, and knew it even more clearly when she arrived at dusk, to find the Duke absent, the house stiff with apology, and Mrs. Fenwick informing her that His Grace had been called away on urgent estate matters, and might not return for several days. A disappointment, of course, Mrs. Fenwick said, in the tone of a woman who believed disappointment should be borne elegantly and in silence. Still, you may make yourself useful by resting and preserving your strength, for when His Grace is able to receive you properly.
Genevieve had spent enough time in formal houses to hear the warning under the courtesy. Do not wander. Do not ask questions. Do not imagine yourself necessary. She might have obeyed if not for Tommy. The child collided with her the next morning in the upper corridor, at a speed no proper nursery routine should have allowed. He had escaped a maid, one stocking fallen down, hair in revolt, and jam on one cuff. He looked up at Genevieve with wide, dark eyes, saw a stranger, and prepared to bolt. Instead, she crouched carefully and said in French-accented English, "If you run that quickly, monsieur, the floor will think you are declaring war." Tommy blinked. Children, she had always thought, preferred honesty wrapped in play to the solemn nonsense adults offered them. "You talk funny," he said. "So I have been told. But I can also tie a rebellious stocking. That is an excellent quality in a friend." He let her help him. That was how it began. By luncheon, she had met Sophie, who watched everyone with the suspicion of a child already accustomed to disappointment, and Henry, who attempted formality so earnestly it hurt to see. The nursery was not violent or wild in the theatrical sense. It was worse. It was lonely. Toys lay untouched, not because the children lacked them, but because joy had no steward. Meals were served, lessons delivered, tempers corrected, and nobody seemed to notice that the small Sunderland hearts had begun to go dim inside all that order. "They need consistency," Mrs. Fenwick said, when Genevieve asked whether the children ever took the air beyond the usual route, or baked in the kitchen, or heard stories by the fire. "They need affection," Genevieve answered, before she could stop herself. Mrs. Fenwick's expression cooled. "They need not be made soft." "Love does not soften discipline," Genevieve said quietly. "It makes discipline legible." The housekeeper never forgave her for the sentence. Genevieve should still have kept her distance. She knew the rules. She was a guest under evaluation, not a governess, not a mother, not yet anything at all. But rules made by adults for their own comfort often looked very different when seen from child height. So she stepped over them. She mended a torn ribbon for Sophie and listened without interruption while the girl informed her, with great dignity, that everyone in the house lied whenever they said things would soon be better. She sat on the floor with Tommy and let him build a fortress from wooden blocks, only to declare with grave seriousness that it lacked a dragon and therefore a purpose. She found Henry alone in the schoolroom, copying sums too perfectly,
and discovered that the boy watched his siblings the way anxious men watch unstable roads. "You are 10, she told him one afternoon. He looked down at the page. "Yes, my lady." "That is far too young to stand guard over all the sadness in this house." He swallowed so hard, it nearly broke her heart. "Someone must," he said. From that moment, she understood the true extent of the injury. These were not merely neglected children. They were children who had been taught, in subtle ways, that love would return only if they behaved well enough, quietly enough, usefully enough. Grief had turned into self-surveillance. Even Tommy, with all the chaos of his age, watched doors between his outbursts. Genevieve began by changing the smallest things. She asked for bread dough in the kitchen and won the cook's distrustful curiosity by admitting she could bake badly, but enthusiastically. She let Tommy knead flour into his sleeves, gave Sophie the power to decide how much cinnamon was enough, and assigned Henry the serious responsibility of watching the oven, because all great houses collapse without one practical soul. For the first time in months, perhaps years, the children laughed, not because they had escaped notice, but because they had been invited into joy. She read aloud at night. She walked the gardens with them in the morning. She refused to let Sophie insult herself before others could. She told Henry that being eldest did not make him accountable for everyone's weather. She never once told them their father did not love them. She merely refused to excuse the shape his love had taken. The servants noticed before anyone else. Cook began sending up better broth. A footman smuggled in chestnuts for roasting. One maid, who had lost a sister young and understood more than propriety allowed her to say, whispered to Genevieve that the nursery had not sounded like children in a very long time. Hawthorne Hall, so long ruled by hushed efficiency, started to breathe differently.
Nathaniel returned on the 6th day. He had ridden through rain, argued with 2 tenant stewards, and expected nothing beyond exhaustion. Mrs. Fenwick met him near the entrance hall, with visible distress and a report that managed to contain both outrage and satisfaction. "The children have become unruly," she said. "The French lady has involved herself beyond all decorum. I feared to dismiss her from the nursery without your command." Nathaniel, too tired to think well, followed the sound of voices to the kitchen. Then he saw the scene that would divide his life into before and after. Tommy standing on a stool between bowls. Sophie smiling in the open way Marianne used to say the child had inherited from summer itself. Henry watching everything, but with something softer than fear in his face. And at the center of them all, Lady Genevieve, flower on her sleeve, laughing low at some crooked biscuit Tommy had declared a horse. Nathaniel had not known how starved he was for the sight of his children alive until that moment made the starvation visible. His first response, unfortunately, was anger, not because the scene was ugly, but because it was beautiful, in a place where he had ceased believing beauty could survive. "What," he asked with dangerous quiet, "is the meaning of this?" The children froze. Genevieve turned to face him fully. She was not the sort of woman he had expected from the arrangement. He had anticipated polished docility, perhaps calculated sweetness. Instead, he found intelligence in her face, and something fiercer than elegance beneath her self-command. "They were hungry," she said. "For biscuits?"
for comfort. It was not a tone a duke was accustomed to receiving from a guest. Mrs. Fenwick. Nathaniel felt the blow of the words before he allowed himself to understand them. "Lady Genevieve," he said, "you have exceeded the place granted you in this house." "And your children," she answered, "have been asked to live beneath the place due them in it." No one in Hawthorne Hall had spoken to him like that since Marianne died. His instinct was to dismiss her, protect himself, reassert order. Instead, he looked at Tommy's hands, still covered in flour, at Sophie's frightened eyes, at Henry already bracing to absorb the punishment of a room, and said the only thing his pride could manage. "Clean them up," he said to Mrs. Fenwick. "I will speak with Lady Genevieve alone." The interview in the morning room should have ended her visit. Nathaniel told himself so, as he stood by the dark hearth and watched Genevieve remove her apron with maddening calm. "You seem determined," he said, "to mistake indulgence for care." "No," she replied. "I mistake neglect for what it is." His jaw tightened. "You arrived 6 days ago." "And your children have been lonely for much longer than that." "They are provided for." "They are not livestock." He stared at her. She ought to have flinched. Instead, she folded her hands. "You may send me away if you wish," she said. "I am aware I was invited here to be judged. But if you ask me to pretend I do not see the sorrow in this house, because truth is inconvenient to your dignity, I cannot comply." Something hard and old inside Nathaniel recognized in her the one quality grief had not managed to kill in him: respect for courage that refused ornament. "Why stay?" he asked, the question escaping before he could shape it more safely. "You owe these children nothing." Genevieve's face changed then, not into softness exactly, but into truth without defense. "No child should ever feel," she said, "that they must become less troublesome to deserve love." He did not ask what history had taught her that sentence. From that day forward, Hawthorne Hall shifted under a tense and fragile truce. Nathaniel did not send her away. He told himself he needed time to assess the household. He told himself the children's attachment made abrupt change unwise. He told himself a dozen things that sounded administrative and not at all like surrender. Yet he began, quietly, to watch. He watched Genevieve in the nursery doorway, listening to Sophie with the seriousness other adults reserved for titled men. He watched her hand Henry a book on naval battles, and then ask what he feared, not what he knew. He watched Tommy fling himself at her skirts after a nightmare, and noticed that she did not hush the boy from embarrassment. She simply gathered him close and let him grieve without making the grief shameful. Nathaniel had loved Marianne deeply. He had never imagined another woman in his house without resentment toward the comparison. But Genevieve did not imitate the dead. She brought her own order, one made of attentiveness, wit, refusal, and a sort of practical tenderness that did not ask permission from sorrow.
When he thanked her, stiffly, for calming Tommy during a storm, she said, "He did not require calming. He required company." When he told Henry the boy was now old enough to understand sacrifice, Genevieve answered, "Then let the sacrifices be made by the adults for once." And when he remarked that Sophie had become less quarrelsome, Genevieve's mouth curved. "No," she said.
she has merely stopped having to throw stones at every hand that reaches toward her. She infuriated him. She also brought him back to his children, a little at a time. It began with a story. Nathaniel entered the library one evening to find Henry sitting beside him without invitation, as if proximity had become less alarming. The boy held a wooden ship and asked, in a voice trying not to sound hopeful, whether father knew how the masts were rigged on a man of war. Nathaniel did know. He spoke for 10 minutes. Henry listened like a starved thing at table. Later, Genevieve met Nathaniel in the corridor and said nothing triumphant. She only looked at him as though placing a fact on record. "They still come when called by love," she said. The words followed him into sleep. Slowly, he re-entered his own house. He took breakfast in the nursery twice a week, then 4 times. He walked with Sophie and let her ask hard questions about death. He sat on the floor to build soldiers with Tommy and discovered the child laughed at exactly the wrong moments and kissed without warning. He allowed Henry into the estate study and listened, stunned, as the boy described how he had been trying to keep Tommy quiet on days when Mrs. Fenwick said father was too occupied to be disturbed. Nathaniel went cold at that. What precisely did Mrs. Fenwick say? Henry's shoulders drew in. Only that you had important matters, sir. That mother would have wanted us to be brave and not add to your burdens. Nathaniel dismissed the boy with gentleness and spent the next hour alone with a form of shame that stripped him bare. He had not ordered such words, but he had built the conditions in which they flourished. That evening he found Genevieve in the winter garden, cutting dead blooms from a potted rose. "You knew," he said. "I suspected. You might have told me sooner. You were not yet ready to hear anything that sounded like indictment." He looked at her through the glass-filtered dusk. "And now?" "Now," she said, "you ask questions before defending yourself. That is progress." It should not have made him want to laugh. It did. That was how intimacy began between them, not in declarations, but in the mutual relief of speaking plainly. He learned that Genevieve hated being displayed for evaluation, and had nearly turned her carriage around twice on the road to Hawthorne Hall. She learned that Marianne's death had convinced him grief was safest when managed like an estate account, privately, neatly, with no room for panic. He learned that Genevieve's former fiancé, Randall Mercer, had once praised her intelligence when alone and treated it as a social inconvenience before others. She learned that Nathaniel's greatest fear was not loving again, but failing everyone twice. "You are not the only person in England who mistrusts happiness," she told him once, standing with him beside the frozen fountain after the children had gone in. "No," he said, "only one of the least graceful in admitting it." Her laugh was low and brief, and did terrible things to his composure. By the 3rd week, the house understood what neither of them was prepared to say. The children certainly understood first. "Will you stay when the month is over?" Sophie asked one night, as Genevieve tucked blankets beneath her chin. Genevieve paused. The question struck with more force than any courtship speech could have managed. "I do not know," she said honestly. Sophie studied her with grave 7-year-old wisdom. "If you go, Tommy will throw a chair. That is not perhaps the strongest argument. It is still true." Henry, from the next bed, said into the dimness, "I hope you stay." Genevieve turned away under pretense of adjusting the candle, because tenderness, too suddenly offered, had always been dangerous in her life. The danger sharpened 3 days later with Randall Mercer. He arrived at noon, handsome as a promise one should have rejected sooner. His manners were polished, his concern exquisitely timed. He announced himself as an old family friend, anxious to ensure Lady Genevieve had not been overtaxed by the unusual circumstances at Hawthorne Hall.
Nathaniel disliked him on sight. Genevieve disliked him for more experienced reasons. Randall bowed over her hand and said, with just enough private emphasis to wound, "I see you have made yourself valuable again." Nathaniel's gaze turned very still. At dinner, Randall performed charm for the table and concern for Genevieve, and in every gesture Nathaniel saw the smooth entitlement of a man who believed access was his by precedent. The children recoiled from him instinctively. Sophie whispered afterward that Mr. Mercer smiled with his teeth and not his eyes. Genevieve nearly laughed despite the dread. The true trouble came the next morning in the old schoolroom. Genevieve had gone there searching for drawing paper for Tommy. Instead, she found a locked side drawer hanging imperfectly shut. Inside lay folded correspondence tied in dark ribbon. She recognized Randall's hand at once. The answering letters were in Mrs. Fenwick's. She read 3 before the blood left her face. So long as the lady remains eager to prove herself useful, the children may become attached enough that His Grace will consider the match from gratitude, if not sentiment. The next letter was worse. If the arrangement succeeds, your position in the household will be secure, and my connection to Lady Genevieve's family properly dissolved. A marriage there would spare us both future inconvenience. There it was at last, the deeper betrayal beneath the polished opportunity. Genevieve had not merely been sent to Hawthorne Hall because she was thought suitable. She had been steered there by people who found her future easiest to manage when she could be transferred neatly from one strategic interest to another. Mrs. Fenwick, who feared losing authority to any genuinely loving mistress of the house, had helped shape conditions favorable to Genevieve's dependence. Randall, who no longer wished to marry her, yet still wanted influence over where she landed, had assisted gladly. And the children, God help them, the children had been treated as leverage in an arrangement they did not know existed. Nathaniel found her in the schoolroom, with the letters in hand and fury so controlled it made her look dangerous. "What has happened?" he asked. She passed him the top page. He read, then another, then another. By the end, his face had gone almost frighteningly calm. "This was done," he said, "under my roof. Yes, to my children, and to me." He looked up. "Why did you not tell me of Mercer sooner?" "Because a woman's history with a man is too often used to reduce her present credibility. I would not arrive here bearing gossip when I had no proof." The justice of it struck him with painful force. He reached for her then, stopped himself, and closed his hand instead. "I will dismiss Fenwick before nightfall," he said. "And then what?" Genevieve asked. "You send away one instrument, and the whole house pretends the music was accidental? No. If this is buried privately, it teaches everyone that children may be neglected and women arranged like furniture, so long as the embarrassment remains discreet." He heard, in that moment, the full architecture of her courage. "What would you have me do?" "Tell the truth, to your staff, to your children in the measure they can bear, to Mercer, to my family if necessary, and then decide whether you want a wife
or merely a woman who keeps your household warm at tolerable personal cost. No one had ever spoken to Nathaniel Sunderland with more fairness or less mercy. He loved her then, fully, though he did not yet say it. Mrs. Fenwick was confronted that afternoon in the long gallery. She attempted propriety, then offense, then tears. She insisted she had only sought stability, that the children required restraint, that Genevieve's influence had made them disorderly, that a grieving father could not be expected to manage every emotional excess himself. "You used my grief as a gate," Nathaniel said, the letters in his hand, "and my children as wards of your convenience." Mrs. Fenwick turned to Genevieve with all the acid of a small nature exposed. "You think kindness qualifies you to run a great house?" Genevieve answered without raising her voice. "No, but cruelty disqualifies you from touching one." By evening, Mrs. Fenwick was gone. Randall was not so easily removed. He came to Nathaniel's study, flushed with indignation, and the confidence of a man used to being forgiven because his manners were excellent. "You mistake practical correspondence for conspiracy," he said. "Lady Genevieve required placement. I sought a future worthy of her." "You sought disposal," Genevieve said from the far side of the room. Randall turned. "I spared you a life of uncertainty."
She looked at him with something colder than anger. "You spared yourself the inconvenience of marrying a woman you wanted to admire only when no one else was listening." Nathaniel had intended to remain controlled. He nearly failed then. "You will leave Hawthorne Hall within the hour," he said. "If you ever again use my children as argument, or Lady Genevieve's future as a matter for negotiation, I will make your exclusion from every decent house in this county a principle." Randall opened his mouth, then read the expression on Nathaniel's face, and thought better of it. When he was gone, silence fell. One might have thought the worst had passed. Instead, the true difficulty began. Misunderstanding does not always come from malice. Sometimes it grows from fear moving faster than trust. Nathaniel, ashamed and furious, threw himself into repairing what could be repaired. He dismissed 2 nursery maids who had reported more to Mrs. Fenwick than to conscience. He altered schedules, reinstated family meals, and began spending entire mornings with the children. The staff, seeing genuine change, rallied around it. Yet in the middle of all this, he made the mistake that nearly lost Genevieve. He spoke to her, in the library after a brutal day, as though gratitude and affection might safely be discussed in the same breath. "I do not know how to repay what you have done here," he said. She went very still. There are sentences that reveal themselves as wounds only after they are spoken. "Repay?" she repeated. He heard it too late. "No, I did not mean—" "But you did, a little." Her voice did not rise. It hurt more for that. "You think in ledgers still, Nathaniel. Improvement for cost. Warmth for debt. A household restored in exchange for the woman who restored it." "That is not what you are." "Then do not talk as if I came here to earn a permanent position by healing the damage others permitted." He stepped toward her. She stepped back. The distance felt like catastrophe. That night, Genevieve wrote 3 letters, one to her mother, one to her brother in France, and one she did not send at all. In the morning, she asked for her trunks. The children learned first. Tommy cried openly. Sophie grew furious in the way of wounded girls. Henry said nothing for nearly a full minute, and then asked, too quietly, "Did we do something wrong?" Genevieve knelt before him at once.
No, never think that, not once. Then why are you leaving? Because love offered in the wrong language can become another arrangement. Because if I stay without being chosen clearly, I shall teach myself once more to survive on usefulness. Because your father matters enough that I cannot bear to remain half-seen. She could not say all this to a child. Because, she answered, stroking his hair back, sometimes grown hearts must be very brave before they can be honest. Nathaniel arrived in the carriage court as her traveling cloak was being fastened. Rain had begun again, fine and relentless. Sophie stood on the steps, weeping without sound. Tommy fought the nurse holding him. Henry remained unnaturally straight, the way some boys do when terror has taught them dignity too soon. Nathaniel took in the scene and understood, with the sick clarity of a man who has finally reached the edge of his own folly, that he was about to watch the center of his house leave, because he had once more spoken as though love must justify itself through service. "Genevieve," he said. She turned. There was no anger in her face now. That frightened him more than any accusation could have. "I am sorry," he said, "for the word, for the thought beneath it, for every way in which I have let duty learn the wrong language and call itself care." She said nothing, so he crossed the wet stones until he stood before her, and the whole household, children and servants alike, could hear the truth if they wished. "When you came here," he said, his voice roughening despite every effort, "you were meant to be measured for suitability. It shames me now to think I allowed any such arrangement to stand. You have done more than comfort my children. You have made me see them. You have made me see myself. But if all I speak of is what you have done for us, then I fail you again." He drew breath. "I do not ask you to stay because Hawthorne Hall needs you, though it does. I ask you to stay because I love you. I love your courage when it is inconvenient, your wit when it cuts cleanly through nonsense, your patience with children, your impatience with cowardice, and the fact that you have never once mistaken tenderness for obedience. If you leave, I will deserve the emptiness of this house. If you remain, it must be because you are freely loved here, not because you have been useful in it." Rain ticked softly on the carriage roof. No one moved.
Then Sophie broke from the steps and ran to Genevieve, clutching her around the waist. Tommy followed with less grace and more force. Henry came last, placing one hand against her sleeve, as though requiring proof she was still present. Genevieve looked down at them, then up at Nathaniel. "This is unfair," she said very softly. "Probably." "You have involved the children in a devastatingly effective argument." A sound escaped her that was half sob, half laugh. It saved them both. "I will not remain as a kindness," she said. "I know." "I will not disappear into your title." "You must not." "I will speak in this house and expect to be heard." "God willing, you will do so often." At last her face gave way, into tears she had denied herself all morning. "Then," she said, "I shall try staying a little longer." Tommy cheered, for reasons not wholly connected to adult nuance. The wedding took place 3 months later in the estate chapel, after Genevieve had received letters from France, full of maternal alarm, fraternal suspicion, and eventual blessing. Nathaniel did not rush her. He learned, perhaps for the first time in his life, that love ripens best when not managed like a timetable.
By then, Hawthorne Hall no longer resembled the house she had entered. The nursery still saw tears, quarrels, muddy hems, and the ordinary upheavals of childhood, but sorrow no longer ruled there unchallenged. Nathaniel was not transformed into some effortless paragon of fatherhood. He remained serious, occasionally withdrawn, and prone to thinking 3 sentences before speaking 1. But he was present now. He read to Tommy even when estate papers waited. He let Sophie interrupt him with her stories. He taught Henry accounts and horses, and, more importantly, the difference between responsibility and self-erasure. Genevieve did not replace Marianne. She became what the future required, herself, fully welcomed. She reorganized the household not toward perfection, but toward life. Music returned to the drawing room. The children took lessons in the morning and built impossible blanket kingdoms in the afternoon. Nathaniel learned that supper could survive laughter. Servants who had once moved around grief as if it were a sacred relic began to live around it instead. On winter evenings, Genevieve sometimes baked in the great kitchen with the children and deliberately left a little flour on the table afterward, as if to remind the house how resurrection had first announced itself. Years later, visitors would remark upon the unusual warmth of Hawthorne Hall. They would notice that the children ran toward their father, rather than away from his study door, that the Duchess listened as if every answer mattered, that even the old servants had grown less brittle under the new order of things. Some would say the French lady had been a blessing from the first. That was not quite true. She had been a disruption, and because she refused to let love remain ceremonial, the blessing came after. As for Nathaniel, he never again confused a well-managed household with a well-loved one. Whenever anyone asked, in later years, how the Duke of Sunderland came to choose his second wife, he would look toward Genevieve, usually with Tommy climbing him, Sophie arguing some point of justice, and Henry pretending not to smile, and answer with a simplicity earned the hard way. "I did not choose her first," he would say. "My children did. She only stayed long enough to teach me the sense of it."